The transport ship smelled like rust and fear and the sweat of 30 alien bodies pressed together in a cargo hold that was never meant to carry anything alive. Cale Morrow sat in the corner with his knees pulled to his chest and his arms wrapped around a metal crate that rattled every time the ship shook through another patch of rough space. He was 14 years old, and he was the only human on the ship. The other recruits filled the hold like a nightmare zoo. Drovar cadets who stood 7 feet tall, with scales the color of dried blood, and jaws wide enough to crush a helmet between their teeth. Sheth cadets, whose bodies were made of something like living crystal that caught the light and scattered it into sharp little rainbows. Colossi cadets, covered head to toe in natural armor plating that looked like someone had welded tank panels onto a gorilla. Every single one of them was bigger than Cale. Every single one of them had already looked at him, decided he was nothing. A Drovar cadet near the front of the hold pointed one clawed finger at the boy and let out a sound that the translator chip behind Cale's ear turned into laughter. "What is that?" the Drovar said to his companion. "Did they run out of real soldiers and start sending food instead?" More laughter. Cale did not react. He just tightened his arms around the crate and listened to the thing inside it shift and scratch and growl. The crate held a honey badger named Bix. Bix was 11 pounds of muscle and fury, packed into a body the size of a small dog, with coarse black and silver fur and claws that could dig through sun-baked earth like it was wet sand, and teeth that were built for cracking bone. The Galactic Military Academy on Thalvor Prime allowed bonded companion animals for species that showed what they called psychological dependency on paired fauna, which was a fancy way of saying that some species needed their animals to stay sane, and humans were on that list. When the intake officer had scanned Bix during processing, he had looked at the readout and then looked at the honey badger and then looked back at the readout. "Threat level negligible," he had said, and stamped the form and moved on. Bix had watched him go, with small black eyes that held no expression at all, except a kind of permanent and deeply personal anger at the entire universe for existing. The ship landed hard. The doors opened onto Thalvor Prime, and the heat hit Cale like a wall made of hot soup. The Academy spread out across a plateau of gray stone, under a sky the color of a bruise. Massive training fields and barracks blocks and obstacle courses that looked like they had been designed by someone who hated every living thing. Drill instructors lined the landing pad in rows, each one bigger and meaner looking than the last. And at the front stood Senior Instructor Vorath Kess. Vorath was a Drovar, but he was not like the young cadets on the ship. He was old and scarred, and one side of his jaw had been replaced with cybernetic implants that gleamed like polished steel when he turned his head. His eyes were the pale yellow of something that had seen 1,000 recruits walk in, and had watched most of them carried out. In his right hand he held a shock rod, a weapon about 3 feet long that hummed with a blue-white charge, bright enough to leave spots in Cale's vision, even from 50 feet away. The rod was adjustable. It could deliver a tap that would make your muscles lock up for a second, or it could deliver a blast that would stop a Drovar heart. Vorath used it the way some teachers used a pointer, casually and often, and with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Welcome to the Academy," Vorath said, and his voice was a deep rumble that the translator rendered flat and cold. "Half of you will not finish this training cycle, because you will fail, and some because you will break, and some because your bodies will give out before your spirits do. I do not care which category you fall into. The hegemony needs soldiers, not survivors." He walked the line of new cadets, inspecting them one by one. He stopped in front of Cale. The silence stretched. Vorath looked down at the human boy the way a person looks at a stain on their boot, not with anger, but with a kind of tired disgust. "What is this?" he said. "Cale Morrow, sir. Human, Terran tribute intake," Cale said, and his voice did not shake. Vorath leaned down until his cybernetic jaw was close enough that Kale could hear the tiny servos clicking inside it. "I know what a human is, boy. Soft skin, thin bones, no claws, no armor, no venom. Your species has been in the galaxy for what, 20 of your years, and in that time you have contributed nothing of military value to the hegemony. You will be assigned Barracks 7, bottom bunk. That is the bunk closest to the waste recycler. Do you know why? No, sir. Because that is where we put the ones who will not last long enough to earn a real bed." Vorath moved on. Kale picked up his bag and his crate and walked toward Barracks 7 without looking back. The first week was exactly as bad as Vorath had promised. The cadets ran obstacle courses designed for bodies twice Kale's size. He finished last every single time, bleeding from his hands and knees, gasping in the thin air of Falvor Prime. The other cadets shoved him in the corridors and knocked his food tray from his hands in the mess hall. And one Colossi cadet, a thick-necked brawler named Dren, made a habit of slamming Kale into walls whenever no instructors were watching. Kale took all of it. He did not cry, and he did not complain, and he did not quit. Every night he crawled into his bunk next to the waste recycler and opened the crate, and Bix climbed out and pressed his small warm body against Kale's bruised ribs, and the boy buried his face in the rough fur and breathed. And every night Bix lay there with his eyes open in the dark, and his lips pulled just slightly back from his teeth, and a growl so low and so quiet that it was less a sound and more a vibration, a promise that traveled through the metal frame of the bunk and into the floor and into the bones of anyone who happened to be listening. On the 7th day, Vorath stood on the observation deck above the training field and watched Kale drag himself across the finish line of the endurance course. Dead last again, but upright and moving and refusing to stop. Vorath's aide stood beside him with a datapad. "The human," Vorath said. "He should have collapsed on day 3. The atmospheric pressure alone should have broken him. His species has unusual oxygen transport efficiency, sir. Markers are, well, they are strange. He is clearly in significant distress, but his motor function is not degrading the way it should." Vorath grunted. "He will not last the week," he said. "None of the soft ones do." Down on the field, Kale crossed the line and dropped to his hands and knees and spat blood into the gray dust. In Barracks 7, Bix sat in his open crate and watched the door and waited for his human to come home. The growl never stopped. It bothered the Drovar cadets who had bet ration credits on him collapsing before day 10. It bothered the instructors who had already mentally filed him under wastage in their end-of-cycle reports. And it bothered Senior Instructor Vorath Kess most of all, because Vorath had broken recruits from 36 different species across his career. And this skinny human child, with his battered knuckles and his stupid little animal, was refusing to follow the script. Kale was not winning anything. He still finished last, or near last in every physical drill. The Drovar cadets could bench press a ground transport, and the Colossi could take a shock blast to the chest and keep walking. And the Sheth could shatter stone with their crystalline fists. Kale could do none of these things. But something else was happening. In the tactical simulation chamber, where cadets faced holographic battle scenarios and had to make decisions under fire, Kale was scoring in the top 5% of the entire intake. The instructors ran the numbers twice because they did not believe them. The simulation AI tracked reaction time and strategic creativity and resource management and the ability to adapt when a plan fell apart. Kale was not just good at these things, he was strange about them. He made choices that the AI flagged as non-standard and high risk, and almost every single one of them worked. In the endurance marches across the salt flats outside the academy, where cadets walked for 16 hours under a sun that could blister Drovar scales, Kale just kept going, long after cadets twice his size had dropped. long after his water was gone, and his lips were cracked, and his boots were full of blood from burst blisters. He kept walking, with a steady mechanical rhythm, that was less like determination, and more like something mechanical had taken over inside him. The Academy medical staff pulled his biometric data, and gathered in a conference room, and stared at it. His cortisol regulation is unlike anything in our database, the chief medical officer said. She was a four-armed Valesi with 3 decades of xenobiology experience. No species show a spike in stress hormones during the first week of training, followed by either adaptation or breakdown. The human's cortisol spiked on day 1 and has been declining steadily ever since. Meaning what? Asked her assistant. Meaning his body is treating the Academy like a threat that it has already learned to manage. His nervous system is literally turning down the volume on pain and fear, not ignoring them, managing them. The way you might lower the sound on an alarm that you have heard so many times, it no longer surprises you. She paused. His species does not just endure suffering, they get bored of it. Nobody in the room liked hearing that. Meanwhile, Bix was building a reputation of his own. It started small. Chef cadet named Torval had tried to kick Bix out of a doorway on the way to the mess hall. Bix had lunged sideways and bitten clean through the crystalline plating on Torval's lower leg. Not deep enough to cause real damage, but deep enough to draw the milky fluid that passed for chef blood. Torval had screamed and stumbled back, and Bix had sat down in the doorway and licked his teeth and looked at Torval with an expression that very clearly communicated he was welcome to try again. A maintenance drone had passed too close to Kale's bunk during a night cycle. Bix had launched himself onto it and torn out its sensor array and one of its propulsion fans, before the drone could even send a distress signal. The repair crew found it in the morning, gutted on the floor like a metal fish, with Bix sleeping on top of it. The Academy's fauna management team decided to run a behavioral assessment. They put Bix in a testing chamber and exposed him to a series of stimuli, designed to measure fear response. Loud noises, and flashing lights, and holographic predators from a dozen different worlds, and electrical deterrent pulses and sonic frequencies that could make a Drovar flinch. Bix responded to all of them the same way. He attacked every single one. The holograms he charged at, the speakers producing the loud noises he tried to tear off the wall, the electrical pulses he bit the emitter nodes until they broke. When they played the sonic frequency at a level that should have sent any small mammal running, he stood in the center of the room and screamed back at it with a sound that was halfway between a hiss and a chainsaw. The fauna specialists sat behind the observation glass and watched their instruments and said nothing for a long time. His aggression index, one of them finally said, "It is not spiking in response to the stimuli." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it was already at maximum before we started." His baseline state is what most species reach only at the absolute peak of a life-or-death encounter. This animal exists in a permanent condition of combat readiness. He is not becoming aggressive. He is aggressive. All the time. About everything. The senior xenobiologist pulled up the Terran fauna database and found the entry for Mellivora capensis, and read it aloud to the room. Documented attacking vehicles and heavy machinery. Documented fighting and driving off lions, leopards, and hyenas. Documented consuming venomous snakes including cobras, and surviving the venom through apparent chemical resistance. Documented digging through concrete. Pursuit behavior continues well beyond caloric cost-benefit thresholds, meaning it will chase a threat far longer than makes any biological sense. Pain response significantly reduced compared to all known Terran mammals of similar size. She put the datapad down. This creature is 11 pounds. It has no armor, and no venom, and no special speed. And it picks fights with everything on its planet, including things that outweigh it by a factor of 40. And it wins, often enough to have survived as a species for millions of years. A silence. Why? Someone asked. Why would evolution produce something like this? The xenobiologist looked through the glass at Bix, who was currently trying to chew through the leg of the testing table, for no apparent reason. That is not the question that worries me, she said. The question that worries me is what kind of planet produces a species that looks at this animal, this thing that attacks everything and fears nothing, and refuses to stop under any circumstances, and says, yes, I want one of those. I will keep it in my home. I will let it sleep next to my children. Nobody had an answer. Back in the barracks, Kale's life had not gotten easier. Dren, the Colossi bully, had escalated from shoving to something more deliberate and more cruel. He broke Kale's equipment so that Kale would be punished for having damaged gear. He contaminated Kale's water rations with a chemical that was harmless to Colossi, but gave humans stomach cramps. He cornered Kale in empty corridors and hid him in places that would not show during inspection. Kale took it all. He never fought back, and he never reported it, and he never showed anger. But he watched. He watched the way Dren and the way Dren's armor plates shifted when he turned, and the way Dren favored his left side when he was tired, and the way the joint between Dren's shoulder plates had a gap of about 2 centimeters when his arm was raised above a certain angle. He watched, and he filed it away, and at night he lay in his bunk with Bix against his ribs, and he thought about it the way a mechanic thinks about a machine. Not with emotion, with patience, with the calm, certain knowledge that every machine has a weak point, and you just need to find it. 3 weeks and 4 days into training, Dren cornered Kale in the hydration bay after lights out. He grabbed Kale by the front of his uniform and lifted him off the ground and slammed him into the wall, hard enough to crack the panel behind his head. "Still here, little soft thing," Dren said, and his armored face was close enough that Kale could smell the chemical tang of Colossi breath. "I keep waiting for you to break, and you keep disappointing me." Kale hit the ground when Dren dropped him, blood running from his mouth where he had bitten through his own lip on impact. Bix was across the room locked in his fauna crate, where regulations required him to be during off hours. Kale could hear him going insane in there. Claws on metal, that horrible grinding sound that meant teeth on the cage bars. Kale looked up at Dren, and he smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was not brave or defiant or any of the things that heroes in stories are supposed to be. It was the smile of something that has been counting and measuring and waiting, and has just decided that it almost has enough information. Dren looked at that smile, and for the first time in his life felt something he could not name. It was the feeling prey gets when it realizes it has been standing in the open for a very long time, and something has been watching from the tall grass. He dropped Kale and walked away, and told himself it was because the human was not worth the effort. A Valesi with a damaged arm, a juvenile chef who had barely passed basic conditioning, and a small drovar who had been sick for a week and could barely stand straight. The opposing squad had 8 members, led by Dren, and stacked with the biggest and most aggressive cadets in the cohort. The exercise was a resource capture scenario. 2 teams enter the Academy's sub-level arena and fight to secure 3 objective points and hold them until time runs out. Standard stuff, except that Kale noticed the shock field boundaries had been set to levels that would put a human in the medical bay for a long time, maybe permanently. He looked up at the observation deck and saw Vorath standing there with his arms crossed and his shock rod hanging from his belt, and an expression on his scarred face that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. The message was clear. The Academy did not officially kill cadets during training exercises. Accidents happened, and nobody investigated accidents that happened to tribute species that were not supposed to be there in the first place. Kale looked at his team. 4 broken and frightened beings standing in the staging area of an arena that had been designed to destroy them, and he felt something shift inside his chest. It was not fear. He had used up all his fear weeks ago, burned through it the way a brake burns through fuel. And what was left on the other side was something quieter and colder and much more useful. He gathered his team. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was low and calm and carried a weight that made all three of them look at him and stop fidgeting. "They have numbers and strength, and they think this is already over. That is the first gift they are giving us. The second gift is that they are arrogant. Arrogant fighters do predictable things. They rush forward and they spread out, and they assume the smaller force will come, panic, and scatter." He drew a quick map of the arena in the dust on the floor with his finger. "We are not going to scatter. We are going to let them take 2 of the 3 objectives. We are not going to fight for them. We are going to give them away." The Valesi blinked. "Give them away? They need all 3 to win. We only need to hold 1 and keep them from completing the sweep until time runs out. If we spread our 4 across 3 points, we are dead in minutes. If we concentrate all 4 on 1 point and fortify it, we become a problem they did not plan for." He pointed to the third objective, a narrow chamber at the far end of the arena with only 2 access corridors and a low ceiling that would neutralize the size advantage of the bigger cadets. "We go there, we dig in, we make them come to us through a funnel where their numbers mean nothing, and we make it hurt every single time they try." The small Drovar looked at Kale with sick, exhausted eyes and said, "You think this will work?" "I think they expect us to lose," Kale said, "and I think the most dangerous thing in any fight is someone who has nothing left to lose and a really good reason to be angry." The horn sounded, and the exercise began. Dren's squad did exactly what Kale predicted. They charged forward in a wide formation and seized the first 2 objectives within minutes, while whooping and roaring and celebrating like the whole thing was already over. By the time they turned their attention to the third objective, Kale's team was dug in. The narrow chamber became a nightmare. Kale had positioned the Valesi at the rear, with a ranged training weapon covering the left corridor. The Sheth cadet at the front, with his crystalline body blocking the right corridor like a living wall. The sick Drovar above, on a maintenance ledge providing overwatch. And Kale moved between them, patching gaps and calling adjustments, doing something that none of the observers had ever seen a first-cycle cadet do. He was reading the battle in real time and adapting faster than the opposition could push. Dren sent 2 cadets through the left corridor. The Valesi dropped them both with precise shots before they made it 3 steps. Dren sent 3 through the right. The Sheth cadet held the line, taking hits that would have flattened Kale, his crystal body cracking and reforming as the training weapons hammered into him. And he did not move, not 1 step back, because Kale had told him to hold, and something in the way Kale said it made him believe he could. Up on the observation deck, the instructors were leaning forward. "Pull up the human's biometrics," one of them said. The medical display showed Kale's body doing things that made the Drovar medic on duty sit down heavily in his chair. His heart rate is elevated, but controlled. His adrenaline output is, I do not understand this. He is dosing himself. His body is releasing adrenaline in measured pulses instead of flooding his system, the way every other species does. It is like his endocrine system is rationing combat chemicals for maximum duration. "That is not possible," another instructor said. "Hormonal response is involuntary." "Not in humans, apparently, or at least not entirely. His prefrontal cortex is maintaining override control on his limbic system. He is frightened and in pain, and his body is trying to panic, and some part of his brain is just refusing to let it." The medic swallowed. "He is wounded. Look, 3 impacts to the torso, 1 to the left leg. Any of those would degrade combat performance in a Drovar cadet by 40% minimum. His motor function has dropped by 6%. 6. His body is redistributing resources away from non-essential systems. Digestion, immune response, long-term cellular repair. That is not directly related to keeping him fighting, and he is doing it voluntarily." "Voluntarily," the instructor repeated. His brain is choosing which parts of his body to sacrifice in order to keep the rest operational. In real time, during combat, at 14 years old. Silence on the observation deck. Down in the arena, Dren had lost patience. He came through the right corridor himself, all 300 pounds of armored Colossi fury, and he scattered the chef cadet like a bowling pin and charged straight for Kale. Kale was bleeding from his side and limping on his left leg, and he was half the size of Dren and had no armor and no natural weapons. Dren swung, and Kale stepped inside the swing, not away from it, into it. So close that Dren's fist passed over his shoulder, and Kale's hand shot up, and his fingers found the 2-centimeter gap between Dren's shoulder plates. The gap he had memorized weeks ago in the corridors. While Dren was beating him, and he drove his thumb into the soft tissue beneath the armor and twisted. Dren screamed. It was a sound that nobody in the arena had ever heard a Colossi make, high and sharp and full of shock. Because the pain was not just physical. It was the pain of discovering that someone had been studying you like a textbook, while you thought you were the one in control. Kale hooked Dren's leg with his own, and used the Colossi's stumble to throw him off balance, and Dren went down, 300 pounds of armor crashing to the floor of the arena, and Kale was on top of him, with his forearm across Dren's throat, pressing into the gap beneath his jaw plate. "Yield," Kale said. Dren looked up into the human's eyes, and saw something that he would think about for the rest of his life. Not rage, not triumph, not hatred, just a flat, patient, mechanical focus. The look of something that had planned this moment down to the last detail, was now simply executing the plan. "Yield," Kale said again. Dren yielded. The horn sounded. Time had run out, and Kale's team still held the third objective, and the score was 2-1, and by the rules of the exercise, that meant Dren's squad needed all three to win, and they had failed. Kale had won. They carried him out on a stretcher because his left leg had finally given up, and the impacts to his torso had cracked 2 ribs, and he was bleeding from places he had not even noticed during the fight. But he was conscious, and when they carried him past the observation deck, he turned his head and looked up at Voreth, and their eyes met, and Kale did not smile, and did not gloat, and did not say a word. He just looked. And Voreth Kess, who had fought in 3 wars, and killed soldiers from a 12 species, and had never once felt uncertain about anything in his long and bloody career, felt something cold move through his chest, like a splinter of ice. Because the boy's eyes did not say, "I beat you." They said, "I am just getting started." That night Voreth stood in his quarters, and held his shock rod, and turned it over in his hands, and thought about the human boy lying in the medical bay, with broken ribs and a torn leg and 2 black eyes, who had taken a squad of 4 rejects, and turned them into something that had beaten his best cadets. He thought about it for a long time. Then he set the shock rod's power to Drovar maximum, 3 times what a human body could survive, and he walked out of his quarters into the dark corridor, and headed toward the medical bay. In the corner of Kale's room, Bix sat on the floor with his back against the wall, and his eyes on the door. The growl had not stopped. He had stood in the doorway, with his shock rod humming at maximum, and he had looked at Kale lying in the bed, with tubes running into his arm, and bandages wrapped around his ribs, and bruises turning purple across his face. And he had looked at Bix, sitting on the floor between the bed and the door, 11 pounds of bristled fur and bared teeth, and absolute refusal, staring up at the Drovar with eyes that held no fear, and no negotiation, and no bluff. Voreth had stood there for 30 seconds. Then he had turned and left. But he had not forgotten, and he had not forgiven. 3 days later, Kale was cleared for duty, not because he was healed, but because the Academy did not give humans extra recovery time, and Kale did not ask for any. He taped his ribs and wrapped his knee, and limped back to the barracks, and that was that. On the morning of the fourth day, the entire intake cohort was called to full assembly in the central training yard. 100 cadets standing in formation rows on the gray stone ground under the bruised sky of Falvor Prime, with every instructor in the academy watching from the raised platform at the north end. Vorath stood at the center of the platform. His shock rod was in his hand. It was glowing brighter than Kale had ever seen it. "Cadet Morrow," Vorath's voice rolled across the yard like distant thunder. "Step forward." Kale felt every eye in the formation turn toward him. 200 aliens watching the smallest person in the cohort walk out of the ranks and cross the open ground toward the platform. He walked without hurrying. Bix was in his regulation fauna crate at the edge of the yard, where all companion animals were kept during formal assembly. The crate was locked and sealed, and rated to contain creatures up to 3 times Bix's weight class. Kale could hear him in there, scratching, grinding, that low, horrible vibrating sound that meant Bix was working on something with his teeth. Kale stopped in front of the platform and stood at attention and looked up at Vorath and waited. Vorath descended the steps slowly, each footfall heavy and deliberate, the shock rod casting blue-white light across his scarred face and his cybernetic jaw. "Cadet Morrow," he said, "you were found to have improperly stored a piece of training equipment following yesterday's drill. Regulation 7, Section 4, Subsection 12. Improper storage of assigned combat gear is a disciplinary infraction, punishable by corrective measures at the discretion of the senior instructor." It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Kale's equipment had been stored perfectly. He had checked it 3 times, because he always checked everything 3 times, because that was how you survived when every system around you was designed for someone else. But it did not matter, because Vorath was the senior instructor, and his word was the regulation, and nobody on this platform, or in this yard, or on this entire planet was going to contradict him. "The corrective measure," Vorath said, "will be administered now." He raised the shock rod. The humming got louder, a high, thin whine that every cadet in the yard could feel in their teeth, and the light from the rod was so bright now that it washed the color out of everything around it. Kale saw the power indicator on the side of the rod. It was set to Drovar maximum, 3 times the voltage that a human body could absorb without cardiac arrest. Vorath was not trying to punish him. Vorath was trying to kill him, and everyone was going to watch, and nobody was going to say a word, because that was how the Academy worked, and that was how the hegemony worked. And Kale was a tribute child from a soft species that had contributed nothing, and he was not supposed to be alive in the first place. Kale did not move, flinch, or beg, or step back. He stood at attention, and he looked at Vorath's yellow eyes, and he waited for the rod to come down. And the rod came down. And the world exploded, not with the sound of electricity meeting flesh, with the sound of metal screaming. Bix hit Vorath's forearm like a missile made of fur and rage. Nobody saw how he got out of the crate. Later, when they examined it, they found that he had chewed through the locking mechanism. Not picked it, not broken it, chewed through hardened steel alloy with his teeth, leaving grooves in the metal that the engineering staff would photograph and pass around in stunned silence for weeks. He had been working on it since the moment Kale walked away from the crate. 11 pounds of honey badger launched from ground level to Vorath's arm in a single leap, and his jaws closed on the shock rod itself. Not on Vorath's hand, not on his arm, on the rod, on the reinforced titanium alloy casing that was rated to withstand impacts that would dent starship hull plating. And he bit through it. The sound was like nothing anyone in that yard had ever heard. A shrieking, grinding crunch of teeth meeting metal and metal losing. Bix's jaws clamped down with a force that the engineering staff would later calculate at over 400 pounds per square inch, concentrated on tooth points smaller than a millimeter. His teeth punched through the outer casing and hit the power cell beneath. The rod ruptured. Blue-white electricity arced out in every direction, a full discharge of the energy meant to stop a Drovar heart. Thousands of volts surging through the destroyed weapon, and into the small furry body clamped onto it. Bix's fur stood on end. Sparks crawled across his back and down his legs, and his muscles locked, and his body convulsed once, with a force that should have thrown him clear. He did not let go. He bit harder, went deeper into the metal, and the rod bent and buckled and the power cell cracked, and more electricity poured through him, so much that his fur began to smoke, and the smell of singed hair filled the yard, and he held on and he growled. The growl was the worst part. It was not loud. It was low and steady, and it came from somewhere deep inside a body that was being electrocuted and burned, and should have been dead already, and it said with absolute clarity that this animal was not going to stop. Not because of pain, not because of fear, not because of any rational calculation about survival, because stopping was simply not something this creature knew how to do. The entire yard was frozen. 200 alien cadets and a dozen instructors stood in perfect silence and watched an 11-pound Terran mammal destroy a military-grade weapon with its teeth while being electrocuted. Vorath stumbled back, the ruined rod still sparking in his hand, and Bix came. With it, because his jaws were locked, and his body was locked, and every fiber of his being was committed to the single task of destroying the thing that had threatened his human. Vorath's free hand went to his sidearm, and Kale stepped forward. That animal will die before he lets go. His voice was not loud. It was quiet and steady, and it cut through the silence of the yard the way a knife cuts through paper, without effort and without mercy. And if you kill him, you will have to kill me next, and if you kill me, my species will find out. And then you will learn what humans do when you hurt their children. Vorath's hand was on his sidearm, his fingers wrapped around the grip, his yellow eyes moving between the boy and the burning, sparking animal that was still growling, still biting, still destroying his weapon. The moment balanced on a point. Every instructor on the platform was watching. The Academy's surveillance AI was recording every angle. 200 cadets held their breath. Vorath looked at Bix. He looked into the small black eyes of a creature that weighed less than his boot, and had just chewed through military hardware, while being electrocuted, and he saw something that he recognized. He had seen it on the faces of soldiers who had been cornered and wounded, and cut off from retreat. The ones who stopped trying to survive, and started trying to take as many enemies with them as possible. The ones who had already decided they were dead, and were now simply negotiating the price. He had feared those soldiers. He had feared them more than anything else in his long career. And now he was seeing that same thing in the eyes of a creature that weighed 11 pounds, and whose entire species existed in that state permanently. He holstered his sidearm. He let the ruined rod drop to the ground. Bix released it. The honey badger dropped to the stone floor of the yard, fur smoking, body trembling, one paw held slightly off the ground where the electricity had burned him. And he limped to Kale's side, and sat down, and licked his paw, and looked back up at Vorath with an expression that said very clearly that if the Drovar wanted to try again, he was available. The silence held for 5 more seconds. Then Vorath turned and walked back up the steps to the platform and past the other instructors, and through the door behind them, and was gone. Nobody moved for a long time. That evening the Academy commandant, a tall, angular Valesi named Cyrith, who had held her position for 20 years and had never once been surprised by anything, sat in her office and watched the surveillance footage of the yard. She watched it 3 times. She watched the honey badger chew through the rod. She watched the electricity pour through its body. She watched it not let go. She watched it lick its paw. Afterward, then she opened the Terran species file on her console and scrolled past the entry on humans, past the notes on their endurance and their cortisol regulation, and their ability to function while injured, and she found the fauna appendix. She read the entry on Mellivora capensis. She read it twice. Then she went back to the main human entry and opened the threat assessment field, which currently read, Low, Minimal Combat Application, Tribute Species, and she deleted it and typed a new annotation, Reclassify, Threat Assessment Revise Upward. They kept these things as pets. They loved them. They chose this animal out of all the creatures on their world as a companion. Understand what that means. She saved the file and closed it, and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about a planet she had never visited, where everything was apparently trying to kill everything else all the time, and the dominant species had looked at the angriest, most relentless, most unkillable thing on the entire world, and said, yes, I want that one to sleep in my house. And she felt something she had not felt in 20 years. She felt afraid. 3 months after the day a honey badger chewed through a shock rod in front of 200 alien cadets, the training cycle ended, and the graduation ceremony was held in the same yard where it had happened. The scorch marks were still on the stone. Nobody had cleaned them. Kale suspected that was on purpose. He stood in formation with the rest of the graduating cadets, 47 of them out of the 200 who had started, wearing the gray uniform of a hegemony soldier, with his boots polished and his back straight, and his hands at his sides. He was lean in a way that he had not been when he arrived. The softness of a 14-year-old boy, burned away by 3 months of pain and pressure and adaptation, replaced by something harder and sharper and quieter. There were scars on his knuckles, and a thin white line across his left eyebrow, where a training round had split the skin, and a way of standing perfectly still that made people who were much bigger than him feel the need to check where he was in the room. He had not finished top of his class. That honor belonged to a Drovar cadet named Voss, who was 7 feet tall and could throw a ground transport across a training field. But Kale had finished, and that fact sat in the room like a stone in a shoe, small and impossible to ignore, because nobody had expected him to survive the first week, and instead he had survived all 12 of them, and beaten the stacked combat evaluation, and watched a senior instructor try to kill him, and was still standing here with his boots polished and his back straight, looking like he planned to keep standing for a very long time. Vorath was not at the ceremony. He had been reassigned 2 weeks after the incident in the yard. Officially, it was listed as a standard rotation to a frontier garrison. Unofficially, the commandant had removed him, because the footage had shown something that the hegemony could not afford to have. Associated with its training staff. Not cruelty. The hegemony did not care about cruelty. Cowardice. A senior instructor had flinched from an 11-pound animal. A senior instructor had holstered his weapon and walked away from a 14-year-old human child. That kind of weakness in the leadership ranks was a virus, and Commandant Cyrith had cut it out with surgical precision before it could spread. The cadets stood in the sun and waited. Before the ceremony began, Dren found Kale. The Colossi walked up to him in the staging area and stood there for a moment, 300 pounds of armored alien, looking down at a human boy who weighed a third of what he did, and the silence between them was not hostile. It was something else, something that had been building since the day Kale had put him on the floor with a thumb in the gap between his shoulder plates. I need to ask you something, Dren said. Waited. Kale, your creature, the small one, it knew what would happen when it attacked Vorath. The electricity alone should have killed it. It knew that. It had to have known that. Kale said nothing. Why did it do it? Dren asked, and his voice was genuinely confused, in a way that Kale had never heard from a Colossi before. Why would any living thing choose to attack something that will almost certainly destroy it? There is no logic in that. No survival benefit. No biological advantage. Kale reached down and scratched Bix behind the ears. Bix was sitting at his feet, the way he always was. The burns on his paw had healed into tough, shiny scar tissue, and the patch on his back, where the fur had been singed away, had grown back slightly darker than before. He looked up at Kale's hand, and closed his eyes, and leaned into the scratch with the expression of a creature that was briefly and grudgingly willing to admit the universe was acceptable. Pause. He did not think about dying, Kale said. He saw a threat to his family. Everything after that was just physics. Dren stared at the honey badger for a long time. Your world, he said quietly. It must be terrifying. Kale smiled. It was a real smile this time, not the cold, calculating thing he had shown in the hydration bay. A real, warm human smile that made him look like the 14-year-old kid he actually was. It is actually really beautiful, he said. That is why everything on it fights so hard. Dren thought about that. Then he nodded once, a slow, heavy movement that carried more weight than any words, and walked away to join his formation. The ceremony began. Commandant Cyrith walked to the podium on the raised platform, and looked out across the graduating cadets and the instructors and the support staff, and she delivered the speech that every academy commandant delivered at the end of every training cycle: duty and discipline, and the glory of the hegemony and the sacred responsibility of the soldier. It was the same speech that had been given 1,000 times before on 100 different worlds. But at the end, she stopped. She paused and looked out at the cadets, and her 4 hands rested on the edges of the podium, and her eyes found Kale in the formation, found him without searching, because she had known exactly where he was standing since the moment the cadets filed in. Some of you arrived here believing that size and power determined survival, she said, and her voice was different now, quieter and more careful, as if she was choosing each word the way a surgeon chooses where to cut. You are leaving with a different understanding. The galaxy is vast, and it does not care how strong you are, or how fast you are, or how thick your armor is. It rewards the ones who refuse to stop. It rewards the relentless. She did not look at Kale when she said it. She did not have to. Ceremony. The assignment officers distributed postings. Kale was assigned to Forward Reconnaissance Unit 12, a small team rapid deployment outfit that operated in contested space on the edges of hegemony territory. The kind of unit that went into places where the maps were wrong and the intel was old, and the only thing that kept you alive was the ability to think fast and adapt faster, and keep going when everything around you was falling apart. It was an assignment usually reserved for Drovar elites and Kalossi veterans, and cadets from species that had been fighting the hegemony's wars for centuries. The classification officer who processed Kale's file, a meticulous chef named Orin, who had processed 10,000 postings in his career and had never added a personal note to any of them, typed a single line at the bottom of the assignment record. Human, first of tribute intake to receive field command track assignment. Accompanied by bonded fauna species. Mellivora capensis. Recommend no attempt to separate. He looked at that last line for a moment. Then he underlined it. 2 weeks after graduation, a classified intelligence briefing was distributed to every fleet commander in the hegemony military. It was flagged as required reading, the highest priority classification, the kind of document that careers ended over if it was ignored. The briefing was titled Terran Fauna as Predictive Model for Human Behavior Patterns. It was 40 pages long, and it was written by the Academy's senior xenobiological staff, and it had been reviewed and approved by Commandant Cyrith personally. And the abstract at the top of the first page read as follows. Analysis of the Terran biosphere reveals a consistent and deeply troubling evolutionary pattern. Organisms on Earth do not optimize for survival. They optimize for defiance. The honey badger is not an anomaly among Terran fauna. It is a template, a standard. Expression of a planetary ecosystem that produces organisms willing to fight beyond all rational thresholds of self-preservation. The humans did not domesticate this creature. They recognized it. They looked at the most stubborn, angry, and unkillable animal on their world, and they saw themselves. Any strategic assessment of humanity that fails to account for this fundamental characteristic will be catastrophically insufficient. The briefing was read by admirals and generals and fleet tacticians across the hegemony. And quietly, without announcement or discussion, the Terran species file was updated in every military database in the galaxy. The threat assessment was changed from low to extreme conditional. The conditional note read, "Threat scales with emotional investment do not threaten what they love." Nobody questioned it. In the corridor of a hegemony warship, 3 weeks after graduation, a group of alien officers, 2 Drovar, a Colossi, and a Sheth, stood talking near a junction point. They heard footsteps. They turned and saw a human boy walking toward them, lean and scarred and quiet, with gray eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing, and beside him at his heels, trotting with the casual confidence of a creature that considered the entire universe to be its territory, and was merely allowing everything else to exist in it, was a small black and silver animal with sharp claws and sharp teeth, and eyes like 2 drops of ink. The officers stopped talking. They moved to the side of the corridor. They did it without thinking, without deciding, the way you move out of the way of a river or a fire or anything else that is not going to stop, whether you are in the path or not. Kale walked past them without looking up. Bix walked past them without looking up. The officers watched them go and stood in silence for a moment, and then one of the Drovar said, "What was that?" "Animal," the Sheth officer answered quietly. "That is the thing that chewed through a shock rod while being electrocuted, and did not let go." Another silence. "What kind of world makes something like that?" the Colossi asked. Nobody answered because they had all read the briefing, and they all knew the answer. The kind of world that makes humans. Kale reached his quarters and opened the door and stepped inside and sat down on the edge of his bunk, and Bix jumped up beside him and curled against his leg, and Kale put his hand on the rough, warm fur and sat there in the quiet. He was 14 years old, and he was very far from home, and the galaxy was vast and full of things that wanted to break him. He scratched Bix behind the ears. Bix closed his eyes and growled, low and steady and permanent, the sound of a creature that was angry at everything and afraid of nothing, and would chew through the bones of the universe itself if the universe ever made the mistake of threatening the boy beside him. Kale leaned back and closed his eyes. He was not afraid. He had brought a piece of earth with him, the meanest, most stubborn, most beautiful piece, and as long as that piece was sitting beside him, growling at the dark, he knew something that the whole galaxy was just beginning to learn. You do not survive Earth by being the biggest. You survive Earth by being the thing that will not stop. And nothing in the universe had yet invented a way to make a honey badger stop. Or a human. The growl filled the small room and traveled through the metal walls and into the corridor, and the officers outside heard it and walked a little faster. And somewhere far away, on a small blue world circling an unremarkable yellow star, a honey badger dug through hard ground in the African sun, and hissed at a cobra, and won. The same as always, the same as forever.